Hi, it's Dr. Tamara Edwards, and I'm coming to you from Magnolia Wellness and Psychology for video number 2 into your introduction into our services, evaluations, and the like. So this video is about autism spectrum disorder. And most likely when I say that, you have a picture that comes to mind already about what that is. Usually that is someone who is cognitively low functioning, who may or may not be verbal in that way. They tend to have pretty obvious repetitive movements or sound effects where they make noises over and over. They may line up their toys in a certain way, or they might have sensitivities to really loud noises to the point where it dysregulates them behaviorally. So they might act out, they might scream, they might hit in some ways as well. And this is usually what comes to mind when people think about autism, but that completely disregards an entire other side of the spectrum that is a bit more subtle and less obvious than the example that I gave, to the point where they get misdiagnosed, they get diagnosed later in life a lot easier and a lot more frequently. So the autistic brain style is one that is unique to each person on the spectrum. Very likely, there are no two people who are autistic that are alike. They might have similarities in terms of the presentation, the characteristics, and different things like that. But the way that those characteristics show up may be different for each person. So their specific interests will likely be different. The way that their rigidity manifests may be completely different. The things that they're triggered by sensory-wise may also be completely different. So it's better to go into these evaluations with an open mind, with some expectations, but not being completely invested into what that outcome may be, or what it may say, what it may mean. And I don't mean that in a way to say just because you think it's autism doesn't mean that it is. Most likely you have done your research and you're pretty aware of different things that are happening and the ways that they happen for you or your child, to the point where we can confidently say that we trust that judgment from you as well. So with that said, autism is considered a neurodevelopmental disorder. So it's one that is frequently manifested in a neurobiological way, and it's also evident in development. For some kids, it's as young as 12 to 18 months. And for some kids, it doesn't manifest until the demands of life or social demands exceed what they are able to do. So it's something that sometimes requires a lot more digging. So we have to be detectives and kind of bring out, our investigative skills to be able to kind of suss out what is what. Usually it is characterized in two wavelengths. So one, you have deficits in social communication and interaction. So these are not even just related to your ability to communicate. That is part of it, but it's also about the back and forth conversation. Are you someone who is able to do that, or is that a struggle for you? In what way is that a struggle, and how does that show up? Nonverbal communication, so difficulty making eye contact or understanding tone of voice. It might be also that person having trouble regulating their own tone of voice, and other nonverbal, so gestures, shoulder shrugs, different things like that. And then you also have the interaction part of maintaining relationships. So are you someone who has trouble making friends, keeping friends, introducing yourself to other people, navigating kind of your social atmosphere in a way where you can interact with people and form lasting relationships? The other wavelength that autism tends to surf on, for lack of a better term, is related to restrictive interests and repetitive behaviors. So one of the obvious ones is the repetitive behaviors and the hand flapping, or something that you repeatedly do with your body. this can also be related to repetitive vocalizations. So if you hear, kids who do like the repeated noises like that can also be something that is a characteristic. You might have someone who has trouble with transitions or changes in routine, or you might see that show up as being really rigid and not being able to be flexible in how they understand things or how other people, present to them. So they're really, rule followers. And if you fall out of line and you break the rules, then, there's no in between. It's very black and white, very all or nothing. This might show up as really specific interests that they have trouble transitioning themselves away from. So if you have someone who is super into horses, and so they know all the different types of horses, all the colors that they come in, they have horse posters, horse notebooks. They can tell you down to the finest detail about horses that the average person probably would never know. So these are things that they are highly, not just interested in, but invested in. So they do a lot of research and digging to get more information around these things to the point where it can be disruptive. And then you also have sensory concerns. So sensitivities to loud noises, to touch. So they may not want anyone to touch them, or they might not feel great with giving affection to other people. Textures, so that's clothing, food textures is another one. Usually, well, I'm not gonna say usually, but there is usually a good percentage that people on the spectrum are picky eaters because they have some type of food texture that they don't like for one reason or another. Either it's too squishy, it's too hard, it doesn't feel right. So you'll kind of see some stuff like that too. Does that mean that just because your kid's a picky eater that they have autism? Absolutely not. It's the function behind that. The reason why is what we explore in our evaluations. So I'm already kind of alluding to that, but an evaluation is supposed to not just determine if the symptoms are present, but we have to talk about what the function of those symptoms is and how it impacts you or your child in your everyday life. So some of the common symptoms that are signs and symptoms that you tend to see with autism, I've already mentioned a few of them. Language development, delayed language development is one of them. Difficulty making eye contact, the sensory sensitivities, all of that. But then you have other people who fall on the more higher functioning end of the spectrum. This was previously described as Asperger's, but we don't use that term anymore only because the newer edition of the DSM-5 has kind of absorbed that into autism spectrum. But some of those more subtler presentations tend to be people who don't necessarily have the repetitive movements, but they have highly specific interests that fall around, not so common things. So this could be like drawing animals or drawing wolves, like wolf people, werewolves, like different things like that. They may have sensory sensitivities, but it might be isolated to one type of sense. So only loud noises and not textures or multiple things that show up like that. They may do well with social activities on the outside. So they may be people who don't have trouble making eye contact. They can make eye contact in the middle of a conversation. They can carry a conversation. They may be able to initiate one. They might have a group of friends. They might have successful friendships in that way. But where their autism shows up is in the way that those things are done, in the ways that those things are maintained. So I can make eye contact, but it makes me extremely anxious and stressed and uncomfortable to know that someone is looking at my face and that they're evaluating me. What if they notice that my eye contact, that I'm not blinking as many times as I probably should? I know that if my friend is sad that I should say XYZ, but the way that I say that comes across as not genuine. Or I know that I should be empathetic to someone who has failed their test, but I might not know how to say that. My tone of voice may not convey that I'm trying to be empathetic to them in their moment of need. They might be able to initiate a conversation, but how much are they involved in maintaining that conversation? Is it very one-sided in that way where the other person is carrying the conversation, but the autistic individual is so good at adapting that it doesn't feel to the other person that they're carrying the conversation? That has also happened. Those assigned female at birth, so women and girls, are often misdiagnosed due to a lot of different things, misdiagnosed, overlooked, diagnosed later in life because they are much better at social adaptation. So they blend a lot easier than those assigned male at birth, are boys and men. They are sometimes a lot more emotionally reactive to the point where they can be diagnosed as bipolar or borderline personality, or they are described as just overly dramatic. You will see that often as well. Our minorities are also a group of people that can be diagnosed later in life or also misdiagnosed as well. So autism is something that requires pretty specific training to be able to assess for, diagnose, and also make recommendations around that. So I've given you a pretty good introduction into autism spectrum disorder. With our evaluations, we're looking at everything across the span. We're looking at cognitive ability. Sometimes it's an academic screener as well, depending on what school is like for you. We also look at more extensively your social development, your language skills. We look at your emotional functioning because emotional regulation is something that commonly co-occurs with autism. And we want to look at how that manifests for you and what type of resources you might need to help manage that as well. So if you have already scheduled yourself for our autism evaluation, then you're already a step ahead. But if this sounds something about any of the things I've mentioned resonates with you, then feel free to either talk to me during our initial appointment to add that on, or check out our blogs or our case studies for more information around that to see whether or not that's something that resonates with you. And if it is, we can always add that testing in. I can always add in a screener tool to help you kind of get a sense of kind of where you might fall in terms of symptom presentation and whether or not that's something we even need to look closer at. Just because you have, different personality quirks and if you're socially introverted, doesn't necessarily point to spectrum behaviors. Like I said, it's all about the function and how that shows up for you. So I welcome any questions that you have. Feel free to reach out to us at info@mwpsychology.com or call us at 678-824-7733, and we'll be more than happy to answer those questions for you. I look forward to getting started with you. Hopefully this video was helpful. Thank you, and I see you soon.